with that, we're ready to proceed.
Opening for the plaintiff. May I proceed?
Yes.
May it please the court. She lost the case before the trial even started. In 2012, Miss Robin Skye is sitting in court for the first time. At only 22 years old, she's scared. She's scared because she's on trial for the murder of her husband. She's scared because life in prison is the punishment. Ladies and gentlemen, she's scared because she didn't do it. But when the jury comes back after only 1 hour, holding her life in their hands, they only tell her one word: guilty. Well, today you're going to find out that the reason Miss Skye was found guilty is because her attorney, Miss Aubrey Gold, didn't do her job. Now, Her Honor is going to instruct you that the real murderer was a burglar who committed 37 burglaries at the same time of day, in the same area, in the same type of house, just like in Miss Skye's case. And that today she is factually innocent. But you're also going to find out that Miss Aubrey Gold, well, she didn't investigate a single one of these burglaries, causing her to not give an opening statement, not call any witnesses, cross-examine only one of the state's witnesses, and not base her closing on evidence. Because it didn't matter to Miss Gold what the outcome of Miss Skye's trial was. She reduced it down to free publicity, as she so eloquently tried. And while Miss Gold moved on to become a successful attorney, her client spent 10 years in prison before she was exonerated. Now, as the plaintiff in today's case, we come before you with a burden to prove by a preponderance of the evidence, or more simply, more likely than not, that the defendant was negligent. This means we must prove that it is more likely than not that 1, Miss Gold was negligent in her representation of Miss Skye. 2, that Miss Skye was wrongfully convicted, which I want to make very clear no one here disputes today. And 3, that that wrongful conviction was caused by Miss Gold's negligence. All members of the jury, today Miss Skye is going to take this stand right here. She's going to look you in the eyes, and she's going to tell you how her attorney lost her case before the trial even started. She's going to share with you that before trial, Miss Gold told her that she wasn't prepared to represent her and never brought up pre-trial investigation into burglaries. And Miss Fernandez, who was a juror at Miss Skye's trial, well, she's going to tell you that exactly what Miss Gold didn't do during Miss Skye's trial. Never brought up a single piece of evidence to support that burglaries could have occurred. Miss Fernandez is also going to tell you why she felt she had to vote guilty. Because she wasn't given evidence to create reasonable doubt. But once we've told you what happened before trial and what happened during trial, we're going to give you a post-trial analysis from an expert, Ms. Kensington Kwan. Now, Ms. Kwan is going to break down why Ms. Gold's decision to not pursue pre-trial investigation into burglaries caused her to not have any evidence to present in trial, and caused Ms. Skye's conviction. Because at the conclusion of today's trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Alyse Saucedo, is going to come before you and tell you that the evidence today will show that Miss Gold lost Miss Sky's case before the trial even started. She's going to ask you to find the defendant liable for negligence. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed? Ladies of the court, counsel. When the prosecution has nothing, you don't open the door. It's a simple principle criminal defense attorneys know. You have to weigh the risks of putting evidence onto the record. Because if you open the door, the state can use that evidence to build their case too. Just a moment ago, plaintiff counsel told you a lot about what Miss Gold didn't do in the 2012 murder trial. But you didn't hear anything about the prosecution. That's because they don't want you to know how bad the state's case was. They don't want you to know that the prosecution's opening statement was 3 minutes. That they only asked 16 questions. They don't want you to know that the state's closing argument was 1.5 minutes. Today you'll hear that because the prosecution had nothing, Aubrey Gold kept the door shut. Members of the jury, both parties agree going to prison for a crime you didn't commit is a terrible injustice. We understand why Miss Sky wants to hold someone responsible for her wrongful conviction. But Miss Gold is not the person to blame. In March of 2012, Aubrey Gold took on Robin Sky's case for free. She hired a private investigator. She put 50 hours into the case. Going into trial, Aubrey Gold knew 2 things. The prosecution had nothing tying her client to murder. And if she were to pursue an alternate theory, like an alibi, the jury would hear evidence of Miss Sky's criminal record, her affair, and her text messages from the day of the murder, saying that she wanted her husband, the murder victim, out of the picture. Today you'll hear that the jury never heard that evidence because Miss Gold kept the door shut. To convict Miss Sky in 2012, the prosecution had to prove her guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, the highest standard in our criminal justice system. Today, when deciding if Miss Gold's actions were reasonable, we'll ask you to remember the defense in a murder trial has no burden. The burden lays solely on the prosecution. And so you have to remember circumstances. The prosecution had nothing. And when the state has no evidence, the last thing a criminal defense attorney wants to do is open the door and give it to them. Despite that, the plaintiff is suing Aubrey Gold for legal malpractice. We don't disagree that Robin Sky was wrongfully convicted. So they have to prove 2 things. That Aubrey Gold was negligent in her representation of Miss Sky, and that her actions were the direct and proximate cause of Miss Sky's wrongful conviction. They have to show. But for Miss Gold's trial strategy, Miss Sky would not have been wrongfully convicted. They have to show that any reasonable attorney would have foreseen that result. They have to prove both those elements by preponderance of the evidence, meaning each is more likely true than another. They'll fail to meet that. Because you'll hear that it was reasonable for Aubrey Gold to keep the door shut. That no defense attorney would have expected a conviction when the prosecution had none. First, you'll hear from Sage Reyes, a retired judge. He'll explain that every trial strategy has potential benefits and risks that Miss Gold had to weigh. He'll explain that her defense strategy of reasonable doubt met the legal profession's standard of care. Next, you'll hear from Morgan Carter, a private investigator. She'll tell you that she spent 50 hours investigating this guy's case. She followed every possible lead, and she pitched the pros and cons of those leads to Aubrey. Finally, you'll hear from Aubrey. She'll tell you that after putting 50 of her own hours into the case, she knew all the possible defense theories. She chose the theory that was in her client's best interest. Simple, reasonable doubt defense. Members of the jury, at the end of this trial, you'll hear that the prosecution in the 2012 murder trial had nothing. Because of that, it was reasonable for Aubrey Gold to keep the door shut. That's why we'll ask you to find Aubrey Gold not liable.